All right, so we'll pick up where we left off last time. Um, so we were talking about how we obtain energy and the process of glycolysis and everything that goes into that. So this week we're going to go to the next step, which is to look at ultimately how plants obtain energy, which again, if it weren't for plants being able to convert sunlight into basic sugar molecules, we would, as animals, have no way of acquiring energy ourselves. So again, it's kind of the take-home message of this section that we kind of go on life and take it for granted. We always can go to the store and buy food. Wild things like this bird, live off of berries and things out there that they forage for. But ultimately, no matter what we eat, whether it's meat or any other type of vegetable matter, ultimately we're all dependent on the fact that the sunlight is worthless to us as animals unless it's converted to usable energy by plants. So that's kind of the theme of this whole section. That ultimately we all depend on photosynthesis. As of the time that I'm recording this, we're a couple months away from Thanksgiving, but obviously that's something that happens every year. And all the food on the table, we give thanks for different things depending on where you're at. But ultimately, whether it's the potatoes, the pumpkin, the turkey, the ham, anything that we ultimately eat ultimately depends on plant material. Anytime in a food chain that you can harvest energy closer to the source, in other words, again, plants are the ultimate source for energy. So when something eats meat, and maybe that thing ate meat to survive, and then that ate plants, the farther away you are from the source of energy, the more energy that's lost. Remember, laws of thermodynamics, energy isn't created or destroyed, but it's transformed from one form to another. And every step down the food chain, some of that energy is lost. So our world basically depends on petroleum, which is plant material that's been preserved, compressed, changed over time into the fuels that we depend on. But those fuels aren't ultimately renewable. They're not a renewable resource. Eventually, whether it's 10 years or 1,000 years, when we harvest the last oil out of the ground, that's it. It isn't made quick enough for us to use it at the rate we're using it at. So we as humans are also thinking to be able to utilize the sun's energy more directly by starting to move away from non-renewable resources and using more renewable resources. For example, in this image, growing a crop of plants that can be converted to biofuel that could power automobiles, or it could power electrical generating plants to run our homes on electricity. But ultimately, it's using photosynthesis. Simply put, we're using photosynthesis to make energy in a way that is renewable and isn't dependent on fossil fuels. Now, there are a ton of problems with this. The idea of being able to grow enough of these plants to supply humans' needs for fuel is probably never going to happen. I mean, it could supplement our demand, but if you think about the millions and millions of barrels of petroleum that we use every day on this planet, tens of millions every day, there just isn't enough land to grow enough fuel to totally replace fossil fuels at this point, at least using these methods. And then the other problem is the more land that we dedicate to growing fuel for our cars, that's less food for livestock that we want to harvest for meat, or it's less food for us, or the price goes up because of those issues. So because of those issues, we're also looking at other ways of growing biofuel. Algae, for example, has a huge potential for the future. Lots of research going on there, looking at plants like kelp that grow incredibly quick in productive waters, where we could use the ocean as a farm and grow fuels. Basically, again, growing plants, carbon-based plants that can be converted into fuel. So bioethanol is basically taking starch and converting it to glucose, then fermenting it to ethanol, alcohol, which is already an additive in a lot of fuels. So using basically a biological process to meet our energy needs. Again, it's already an additive in the flex fuel that's out there. Definitely problems with ethanol. We have to use other fuel additives to kind of deal with the issues that come from having more ethanol in our fuel. But ultimately, we're going to have to do something other than burning oil, converting oil into gas and burning it, because it will run out eventually, and it's also pollutant to the environment. So there are a couple of links here that I'm not going to show right now, but you can go to the PowerPoint in Canvas and click on these links, and they're short little clips about algae to fuel research that's being done along with biofuels. So basically this group of organisms that carry out photosynthesis, meaning plants mostly, different kinds of plants, including algae and bacteria, are also classified biologically as autotrophs, or more specifically, photoautotroph. So troph refers to consuming or eating or energy. Auto means self, being able to generate your own energy. And then photo, of course, refers to sun. So plants of all kinds, algae, and certain bacteria that we reference here, specifically what are called cyanobacteria, are all photoautotrophs because they can take the sun's energy, they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they take water from the soil typically, although they can also absorb some through their leaves at times. And then they use those simple ingredients to make oxygen, which is great for us because we happen to breathe oxygen. And plants actually fundamentally changed the atmosphere as they evolved over billions of years. And very importantly, the other product they put out is sugar, simple sugars that then are stored in the leaves and the stems and the roots of plants. And then consumers like us or cows or deer or anything else can actually eat that and obtain their energy for survival. So whether things eat the flowers or get the nectar from the flowers like hummingbirds, whether they browse on the leaves like deer might, whether they eat the seeds like birds might, whether they eat the roots, for example, like gophers would, other things that eat the wood or the bark, insects, for example, everything does ultimately depend on sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to produce the food that we all depend on. So again, some terminology. We talked about the autotroph and specifically the photoautotroph, in other words, the plants and some of their relatives. We fit in the category of what's called a heterotroph, eating other things. Hetero meaning different or other, and troph, again, referring to food or eating or consuming. So heterotrophs are organisms that depend on other things for their food. They can't make their own food like plants can. So in this case, of course, the typical African scenario where you've got a cheetah chasing down a prey item there. And don't worry, the little antelope there escapes. Trust me, it's all right. Um, and so then again, reviewing the terminology: auto, self; hetero, other; troph, referring to feeder, eating, consuming. So again, energy is ultimately stored in carbohydrate molecules, and we've already looked at that in previous chapters through the process of photosynthesis. And then those different types of carbohydrate molecules, whether they're simple sugars, complex sugars, starches, etc., ultimately pass through the food chain. So this is in reference to energy flowing through a food chain from energy that's created by plants through any other consumer level, from the prey to the predators to their predators. And then ultimately, when that living thing dies, it's decomposed and those molecules are released back into the environment for other organisms to eat, whether it's the decomposers like mushrooms or a vulture. That energy just keeps flowing until it reaches the end of the food chain. But ultimately, again, everything is dependent on photosynthesis. Every can of food in the grocery store, every vegetable in the fresh fruit aisle, every frozen piece of meat in the frozen section, ultimately every single thing that we depend on originates from the sun. Again, same idea that we looked at a few slides ago, just reviewing or looking at it a different way. But this is ultimately the chemical formula in a real simple format of what happens during photosynthesis. And excuse me here, I'm trying to sort something out and I'm once again having no luck, so I'll just go back here. Again, we have sunlight coming in from the sun, and remember, only the sun's a long ways off. That energy travels across a lot of space. So of all the energy that's being produced by the sun, less than 1%, less than 1% of that energy actually hits the surface of the earth. So again, we're already losing a lot of energy just because it has to travel across a great distance. But then that very small percentage strikes the earth. A small percentage of that is actually taken up by the plants. Again, they're taking in water through the roots, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so there's not usually a shortage of CO2, although there can be. There can be a shortage of water for plants, depending on where on the planet you are. Near the equator, lots of sunlight. Farther away from the equator, lots of sun in the summer, but less sun in the winter. So photosynthesis varies over the course of a day, over the course of a week, a year. But ultimately then those plants make sugars and again produce oxygen that we're also very much dependent on. We depend on the food. It's easy to kind of remember that, but sometimes it's easy to forget how ultimately dependent we are as well on the oxygen that the plants produce. So here's the actual chemical formula of photosynthesis. For every 6 carbon dioxide molecules. We also need 6 molecules of water. And of course, that has to happen in the presence of sunlight. That's the, the source of energy that drives this chemical process. We ultimately get 6 molecules of oxygen and then a molecule of glucose, which consists of 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And again, you hopefully recognize this formula from the last chapter that we looked at. The only difference is that instead of it going from carbon and water with sunlight, creating sugar and oxygen, what was happening in the previous chapter is we would breathe in oxygen, we would eat the sugar, eat the glucose molecules from the plant, and in turn that would produce water and exhale carbon dioxide. So again, what's really neat here is that the way plants, the chemical production of food for us, and then our process of respiration are opposites of each other. So as long as you remember one, you pretty much already know the other one. Again, photosynthesis is going in that direction on this slide. Carbon dioxide, water, making sugar and oxygen in the presence of sunlight. And then when we eat that sugar and breathe in the oxygen, our bodies produce excess water and we exhale CO2 as a byproduct of glycolysis. So kind of a neat process that has evolved here on the planet between plants and animals. Now, remember I mentioned only a small percentage of sunlight even makes it across the cosmos and strikes the Earth. Of all of that little bit of sunlight that actually hits the Earth, of course not every square inch of a plant actually does even photosynthesize. And even though you might think, well, okay, I know it's not the bark, it's the leaf, but even not all cells of a leaf actually photosynthesize. So there's also some loss there. It's the cells within the middle layer. So the second image down below the leaf there, you see the upper epidermis, so top part of the leaf, the lower epidermis, which is the underside of the leaf, and then there's the in-between section called the mesophyll. Meso is a biological or anatomical term for middle or between. So upper, lower, and then the mesophyll. And so it's within the mesophyll that has the actual chloroplasts, little oval green organelles inside of those cells in the mesophyll where actually the photosynthesis occurs. And so we'll look at sort of the structure of this whole process. Notice on the leaf, the second image down, and again, I do not know why I keep losing my pointer here to be able to highlight some things on the screen. It works and then it doesn't. We've got the mesophyll, and then notice in the lower epidermis we've got the little opening called the stomata. So remember, plants have to take CO2 in, right? We talked about that in the equation. So the way they get the CO2 from the air is through their stomata, and that's also how they get rid of the oxygen that they make. And so then we zoom in even closer and see the and then we see the representation of a cell, the nucleus, ribosomes, vacuoles, and then the chloroplast. And we zoom into the chloroplast and we see that there's an outer membrane, and then inside of that chloroplast membrane are some other structures that we'll look at in just a minute. So again, reviewing, the stomata are the openings typically on the underside of the leaf, although there are leaves that have stomata all over the surface of the leaf. But those are the, again, the openings or the doorways that allow gas exchange, whether it's CO2 in or O2 out. And keep in mind, they don't stay open all the time. It's regulated. You know, you don't leave your doors and windows open in Reading in the summertime because you want the inside of the house, you know, a little cooler than the outside of the house typically. If a plant's stomata were open all the time, it could get too much CO2 or more than it would need, or more importantly, maybe it could also lose water, you know, like we sweat, plants transpire. So those stomata are regulated. The opening and closing of those is regulated by the plant. And there's an actual image, an actual photograph under a microscope, obviously, of the underside of a leaf. And you see the cells of the lower epidermis. Got to turn Siri off here. She keeps hearing me talking and thinking I'm trying to get her to do a search for me. So technological problems, right? Never would have had this issue. I couldn't imagine having my phone waking up and trying to communicate with me 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So again, you see the cells on the lower epidermis with the nuclei there in the middle, those dark spots. And then you see 6 stomata there, guard cells on either side, and the guard cells are the ones that regulate whether the stomata open or close. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and pause here because now I got something else going on. I will be right back. All right, the perils of working a lot at home. Anyway, so, and again, there's my mouse now. God knows why that showed up. So again, we have the guard cells here on either side, and then the stomata here in the middle. These are, looks like most of these are closed all the way, or maybe just open a tiny little bit there. So let me go back to the slide view here, and of course I'm gonna lose my mouse, but that's okay. So in lab, if you're in lab, the cells we've already looked at in a couple different labs. Elodea, which is an aquatic plant. It's really easy to see the chloroplasts. Again, these are the green objects you see inside of all of these cells, and typically they're moving around inside as well, so they kind of circulate in there. Pretty easy to see them. And again, it's right there where photosynthesis occurs. And then inside of that are the thylakoids that contain the actual chlorophyll, which are the pigment basically that makes plants green. Here's actually, again, an image under an electron microscope, and you see those kind of vertical dark lines there. Those are actually the thylakoid inside of one of the chloroplasts. So again, the actual site of photosynthesis. I'm never going to ask you to draw a chlorophyll molecule. If this were organic chemistry, you'd probably have to know what this molecule looks like and so forth. But fortunately for this class, you just have to know that chlorophyll is the green pigment, and it's an important molecule in the process of photosynthesis. See, I'll go back here a minute. This might. I'm just going to kind of keep it here so I've got my cursor again. So there are 2 components of photosynthesis that we're going to look at here over the next several slides. 2 parts or processes that happen. And notice this capital P lowercase s is sort of a standardized abbreviation for the word photosynthesis. So beware, that's what that represents, and that you can also use that as an abbreviation for photosynthesis. But anyway, there's the portion called the light-dependent reaction, again, chemical reaction, Rx, and this happens in the thylakoid membrane within the chloroplasts, and that purpose is to convert that solar energy, that ultraviolet light and bands of the color spectrum of light, into chemical carriers. And then there is the Calvin cycle. Move some of this out of the way for a minute here, which happens in the stroma. So we've got the light-dependent reaction, which again involves the chlorophyll molecule. Chlorophyll molecules get excited and basically produce ATP. The water that's involved in photosynthesis, of course, is necessary, creates hydrogen ions, and then as the water molecules broken apart to generate these hydrogen ions, that's where the oxygen is released. And of course, then that's released out of the plant. That hydrogen ion loads up the NADPH molecule, the electrons given off here, and there also end up generating the ATP, which is important for the process. And so we'll look at this this entire process, the Calvin cycle, as well in a little more detail in the next slides. But this is kind of a quick summary of the process. You've got the CO2 that comes into play in this case. There are three phases in the Calvin cycle: fixation, reduction, and regeneration. So the CO2 is fixed. One of the molecules, the NADPH, then to fuel the process, again, takes energy, right? Think about pushing rolling a rock uphill or something, rolling a car moving down the road, takes energy to move those tires. So the NADPH that was created back here fuels part of that process. So the hydrogen ion is given off, resulting in NADP. It's got a little positive charge. ATP that's generated in the light reaction also then fuels the reduction process. So one of the phosphate groups is given off to release some energy, resulting in ADP. This then creates one glucose molecule, and then the process has to be regenerated. So ATP is used to fuel the regeneration process. But again, we'll look at this in a little more detail here. Before we get into the actual light and dark reactions, we need to kind of look at light. So again, initially light's the source of being able to drive photosynthesis. And so one of the questions we ask, and we asked, scientists asked a long time ago, is we understood the idea that it took light to grow plants, but obviously before microscopy and such, we didn't know how. So how can light make food? And that's what we're going to be looking at here with the understanding of the light and dark reactions. So a couple bits of terminology when we're talking about light. It basically is a wave of energy. And so that wave has a wavelength, which is the distance between two high points or two low points, two crests basically. And so then the crest is the high point of the wavelength, the trough is the low point. A weaker energy would be, there'd be a greater wavelength, a greater distance between the crests. Higher energy, like ultraviolet light, the wavelength is shorter, so the wavelengths are shorter, farther apart, and the crests might be higher, troughs might be lower, the stronger the wavelength is. Of course, the sun emits energy across a wide band of our electromagnetic spectrum, from very weak wavelengths or very weak types of energy down on the far right of the spectrum, like radio waves. I don't know how many people even ever listen to AM radio any longer, because with internet radio and all kinds of different technologies, I don't know how many people even know AM radio exists. But back when I was growing up, I could listen to an FM radio station that was maybe 30 miles away from where I lived. But I could pick up AM stations that were 100 or more miles away. And that's because of the AM band that they were using has a very long sort of wavelength, so it can travel quite far. It's not very strong, but it can travel a great distance, meaning you can pick up stations from a long ways off. So on the far right side of the spectrum, you've got radio wavelengths, and then you start getting to the infrared, which is basically heat energy. When the sun shines down on the earth, and let's say you've got a little greenhouse in your backyard for getting fruits and veggies started earlier in the year, that sunlight will go through the glass of your greenhouse because it's coming from the left side here. It's got strong UV wavelengths. They're shorter. They got higher crests, so they're stronger. They can punch right through that glass. But then when that wavelength of energy gets absorbed by the plants in the color band here, the visible light spectrum that we deal with, from the ultraviolet to the red side, or from the blues to the reds, that energy gets absorbed by soil, rocks, plants, and then it gets re-emitted as infrared radiation. So that infrared radiation isn't as strong, and it just ends up kind of bouncing off. Some of it might make it through the glass, but a lot of it bounces off of the glass, and so then it gets trapped, and that's how your greenhouse gets warm, because of the infrared energy being trapped, because it's too weak to push its way back out. And then as we get on the far left side, we've got really strong energy, X-rays. They're strong enough to penetrate our body, to be able to see inside of us, gamma rays, and so forth. But what we're dealing with when we're talking about photosynthesis is basically the visible light spectrum for the most part. And this is the range that plants use for their actual photosynthesis. Now, keep in mind, not all plants need full sunlight to grow. Some actually don't do well in full sunlight. They can get burnt and they can die because they get too much light. So you've got plants that are shade tolerant, a lot of plants. In this general area, we've got trees called white fir, Douglas fir, incense cedar. Those tend to be more shade tolerant species. They grow in the understory, like you see here, all those trees growing underneath the big ones. Sprout, seedlings start growing, and they may not grow really quick all the time, but they just kind of grow. They're really efficient at being able to absorb sunlight because of a variety of pigments they have, and each different pigment, which are the different colors, and we'll look at like again chlorophyll's a pigment, and so they have different pigments that allow them to absorb different wavelengths of light, because again, if you're in the shade, not all of the wavelengths of light are making it down to where you are. Some of them are being absorbed by the other trees, and so only some of them are going to make it through. So those plants have evolved to be really efficient at absorbing that, that sunlight because of the pigments they have. So there's chlorophyll A. There's actually more than one type of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll A focuses on the blue and red light that is in the visible light spectrum. Chlorophyll B absorbs blue, but also more on the red-orange side of the visible light spectrum. And here's a figure that kind of shows how the absorption and is affected over the wavelengths of light. So again, I don't have my cursor. Imagine that. Let me go back. Maybe I'll get it back here. There we go. Make this a little bigger. So across the bottom we have the wavelengths of visible light from the violet on the one end of the light spectrum to red on the opposite side here. And so then we have the corresponding wavelengths in nanometers. And then on the y-axis, the estimated absorption percentage. Chlorophyll A is represented in blue line. Chlorophyll B is represented by the red line. So it's just showing you basically that chlorophyll A is more efficient at absorbing the violet colored light. Chlorophyll B is more efficient at absorbing the blue visible light. Either one of them do a very good job down in the green yellow side. And then chlorophyll B picks up again on the orange red side of the spectrum, and chlorophyll A picks back up when it's solidly in the red light. So again, these different pigments, these different types of chlorophyll allow plants to be efficient across a bit of a spectrum of the light that might be available. And again, what's going to affect the light availability is several factors, but for example, again, if you're in the shade under other trees, not all of these visible light types are going to make it through. Remember, the ones on the left side, the violets, blues, are stronger than the reds. So on this side, we go from ultraviolet, which is a really strong wavelength that can penetrate through the atmosphere, through greenhouse glass. And so more of this might make it through the canopy of other trees. And then we've got the other side of the spectrum, which is longer wavelength, weaker light. If any of you ever have gone scuba diving or gone underwater, maybe in a submarine, for example. I went in a submarine when my wife and I were in Hawaii. Went down about 110 or 120 feet, and we saw shipwrecks. There was a plane wreck there as well. And when you get down that far, colors kind of go away, and all you tend to see are these more blue or green colors. And so we talked about the plants in the shade and not getting access to all of the visible light spectrum. Imagine you're an aquatic plant down at the bottom of the lake or the ocean, 50, 70, 100 feet down. A lot of the light is going to be filtered out by the time it gets down to where you are. And remember, photosynthetic aquatic plants still need light. They still depend on sunlight. That's also why when you get far enough down in water, eventually there can be no plants. There can be photosynthetic microscopic organisms that photosynthesize up closer to the surface, and then they may float down, and so they can exist down there, but they can only photosynthesize when they're close enough to the surface to actually get sunlight. So aquatic plants have a harder time getting the light they need because of all the stuff that's in water that ultimately affect the ability of light to penetrate. So even really pretty fish when you get down low, because the light isn't there to reflect the colors that we see them at in an aquarium, they may just look plain. You may not be able to tell all the pretty colors they are. And again, ultimately, the point of this is that that's just making it hopefully clear how not all wavelengths of light make it down for these aquatic plants, and so they have to sort of specialize in being able to photosynthesize in low light conditions. All right, so got a diagram here of the chlorophyll molecule. We've got the light coming in. Again, here in the big picture is the chloroplast, right? And then within this big chloroplast, you've got the stroma, which is the liquid inside of the chloroplast. And then you've got the thylakoid membrane, the individual little disc-shaped structures. And again, notice the thing we've seen a lot of, right? Our phospholipid bilayer that makes up the thylakoid membrane, just like it makes up any other cell membrane. And then you've got what's called a photosystem. And so then the light interacts within this photosystem to excite this electron, and then interacts with the chlorophyll molecule. And so it's driving this process. The water that the plant would take up interacts with this energetic chlorophyll molecule in the reaction center. And this is where the hydrogen ions are broken off, and those will be used later, and also where the oxygen is broken off. So then that oxygen eventually gets passed out of the system. So again, the light energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll molecule, which again is this smaller little green structure inside of this photosystem. It's passed along a pathway to other chlorophyll molecules. Ultimately, the energy culminates in the reaction center, where it excites one of its electrons enough to leave. And so then this electron is what then is able to split the water molecule, releasing the hydrogen ions, as well as, again, releasing the oxygen. So if we zoom out here kind of to the whole thing that's happening, we actually have two photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Seems like, well, if the first step is here, why isn't this photosystem 1? It's because this was actually discovered before this. So even though photosystem 2 is the first step, or the first location for the beginning of photosynthesis, it's numbered backwards just because the order it was discovered in. And again, I may or may not have a link. So I've actually do have a link here that you can, again, watch on your own time, or you can Google photosynthesis. And again, I would really suggest strongly that you watch the animation of this process, because again, just me, like you, like most of you, I'm sure, you read a bunch of words in the book, which you have to do. The explanation of how it happens is important, I think. That helps you understand it. You see a static drawing that tries to convey, a process, light coming in, the chlorophyll molecules in here carrying, the electron that finally breaks off, causing the water molecule to split into oxygen and hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions are going to stay here in the thylakoid space and eventually come back into play here. This electron then is transported down this chain. You have hydrogen ions kind of fueling the process by passing through here, just again kind of a way that they keep pushing the electrons on through the process here. And then more light interacts with photosystem 1, keep the electrons moving. You have NADP that is kind of rebuilt into NADPH by this electron that's been carried all the way through this process. That NADPH, which again is just a little energy pill, that's going to be used again later. And then you have those hydrogen ions that have been down here that now get pumped through the ATP synthase. So again, an enzyme here that synthesizes ATP. So these hydrogen ions are the energy source to take these ADPs that were created in a different part of the process that we'll put it all together here. And then those hydrogen ions rebuild the ATP molecule. So we've built the NADPHs, the ATPs, and those are used in the next step of the process. So basically this part of photosynthesis, using light and using water, basically is creating hydrogen ions and these electrons. Ultimately, the end point, the purpose of this whole part of the process is to make ATP, NADPH, and then these hydrogen ions are also going to come back into play. So again, this first part of the process is simply making the energy molecules that'll be needed in the next part of the process. Get a quick sip here. So again, that was the light-dependent reaction that we just looked at. Light-dependent because we need the sunlight. And again, that's happening inside of the chloroplast. And inside of the chloroplast, we have the granum and the individual thylakoids. So remember, that's where the light's coming in. Light's coming in to our thylakoid. Water's coming in. Light in, water in. And remember, what's being produced is oxygen is being produced as a byproduct along with these energy molecules. So the whole point of the light reaction is basically to generate energy that can be used to fuel the Calvin cycle or the light independent reaction. So the Calvin cycle or the light independent reactions don't need sunlight to fuel them. They just need the energy molecules that they created. So if we zoom into that, we have the CO2 that again the plant's taking in through the stomata, the openings in the underside of the leaf. And so we need 3 molecules of CO2 to run the cycle. And remember, there's 3 phases to the Calvin cycle: carbon fixation, the reduction, and then the regeneration stage. So in stage 1, there are some enzymes that come into play. Rubisco takes the carbon dioxide and incorporates it into an organic molecule. That's what fixation means, basically. And then we need some of that ATP that we generated in the light reaction. And so now we have this organic molecule that's reduced, and we reduce basically this molecule that we made in stage 1, 3-PGA, And again, for our purposes, the book tells you what that means, but I don't really care that you memorize, exactly what those mean, just that you understand generally what's happening here in the Calvin cycle and in the light reaction. So 3 molecules of CO2. The carbon is fixed or incorporated into an organic molecule. Energy fuels the next step of the process, which converts 3PGA into G3P. Again, the organic molecule is reduced, and so that's what's going on here. If we were in the full-blown bio class, you would probably have to know a little more detail, and you certainly can read the book and look at even more detail if you're interested. The process is again fueled by more of that energy, so those NADPHs that are produced in the light reaction are used to keep the merry-go-round spinning. The G3P molecule that we created in the reduction phase now basically is going to need 6 turns. So each one of these G3P molecules that's produced is going to need 6 times around. And so again, that means a lot of energy is going to be needed to keep spinning this wheel, this Calvin cycle, until we eventually get one glucose molecule, 1C6H12O6. So again, we need the carbon as the source of the carbon dioxide as the source of carbon, ultimately for our glucose molecule. And then again, lots of ATP and NADPH to spin this process around to generate one sugar molecule. And of course, each time it does go through all 3 stages, including the regeneration of the molecule that's the root of the enzyme that's ultimately needed back in stage 1. So we regenerate the RUBP, which again takes energy, and we rebuild this Rubisco molecule, which is ultimately used then to restart stage 1. So again, we need these molecules of CO2, and ultimately this Calvin cycle has to go around 6 times to generate one sugar. So the total energy required to make one molecule of glucose is 12 ATPs and 12 NADPHs. So it's kind of simplified here that you got 3 molecules of CO2 coming in for every complete step, and so that's why it says 12. You think if it takes 6 ATPs and it needs 6 revolutions, it would take 36 ATP. But it's kind of simplified here that for every 3 molecules of CO2, you need 6 ATPs and 6 NADPHs. So ultimately, you need 6 molecules of CO2. And again, that's where the 6 carbons come from for the C6H12O6, that's the glucose. And so then for every 3 molecules of CO2, you're going to need 6 ATPs and 6 NADPHs. So you need 6 molecules of CO2 totally, and then that's going to be a total of 12 ATPs and 12 NADPHs. And then ultimately 6 ATPs in the regeneration phase to make one molecule of C6H12O6. And again, like so many other concepts in biology, this one's even more complex than we're making it here. And again, all I can say is that take advantage of all the YouTube stuff out there. Go look for videos and animations of this process, and I think it'll make it a lot easier to understand if you can see it in an animated way to help you understand how it happens. So the process we've been talking about is the way it happens in eukaryotic organisms, eukaryotic plants. But there are prokaryotic organisms, single-celled organisms like blue-green algae that also photosynthesize. They don't have nearly as complex of a process. They actually just have folds, a region in their cell that's folded, that are the thylakoids. So they don't have stacks of thylakoids that make up granum. These are areas of the membrane that are folded, that function like thylakoids do in eukaryotic plants. They don't contain, they aren't contained within an organelle like a chloroplast, but everything they need to photosynthesize is there. So they're just much simpler organisms and are still able to carry out photosynthesis, just in a more simplified structure than other higher plants are. Something else to mention, I don't know how many of you use flashcards still. You know, you buy 3x5 note cards and write terms on one side, write the answers on the other side. And this would be a good place to pause too if you want to stretch and do your thing. But you probably knew this before I did, that there are all kinds of flashcards available online. Different, I can't remember the names of them off the top of my head, but if you Google, you know, biology flashcards, there are websites and even apps that you can set up. They come kind of preloaded, like, you know, what's the subject, you know, general chemistry, and what's the unit, you know, periodic table, and then you can just have all these flashcards that are already there for you. So you can do the same thing with biology. You can access flashcards, tell it what unit you're on, and then it's just another way, basically, you can approach studying for this class. Obviously, the book has keywords, and those are the things that you ought to focus on. But instead of you making your own flashcards, for example, you could use these as a way to be able to study for the class. Now, again, photosynthesis is, as with most things, it is more complex than the relatively simplified version that we cover in this level of a biology class. So as far as, you know, looking up, again, images, reading the book, obviously, but researching and finding videos and animations to help you see the process, like photosynthesis, how the molecules actually move through the whole process to ultimately generate glucose, might be helpful to some of you. So take advantage of any of those other resources that you can to help you get a grasp on at least the level that we teach in this class. So that's kind of photosynthesis in a nutshell. Keep in mind that there isn't just one specific exact way that photosynthesis happens in every single plant. I briefly mentioned the prokaryotic plants or prokaryotic organisms, like certain types of algae or bacteria that actually photosynthesize. They have a much more simplified setup. You know, they don't have chloroplasts, etc., but they still photosynthesize. Most other green plants, whether it's grass or shrubs or trees or flowers or tomatoes in your garden, photosynthesize following the process that we just went over. But realize that there also are other types of plants, and there are a couple other versions of photosynthesis that occur. Think about all of the really dry, harsh climates on the planet, things we would typically call deserts, places that get a minimum amount of rainfall each year, create pretty harsh conditions for plants. Now, generally you don't think sunlight's limited in the desert, so plants would have all the sun they need to photosynthesize. You would think that carbon dioxide in the air wouldn't be limited in the desert. So in other words, that wouldn't be something that affects the ability of a plant to live and photosynthesize. But what is one of the other requirements for photosynthesis? Of course, I'm getting at water, right? And in a desert, water may be a limiting factor. So plants have had to evolve adaptations that allow them to harvest water whenever it happens to be available, and to be able to store that water so that they can carry out photosynthesis. Cacti, for example, have basically evolved a different looking anatomy. They don't have leaves like most plants typically do. They don't even really often have an extensive root system. They store a lot of their water inside of the plant itself. And yet they need to photosynthesize, right? So if they don't have leaves, they don't the chloroplasts aren't in the leaves. And so for cacti, if the plant is green, we know it has chloroplasts in it. And of course, that's ultimately and chlorophyll, and so ultimately those are needed for photosynthesis. So leaves become a liability if you're in a hot, dry climate. When it's hot and really low humidity, moisture evaporates quickly. That's why if you're in a really hot, dry climate and you're outside working, you don't typically sweat and make your clothes wet to where you see like, geez, I'm sweating. I know I'm losing water. When it's hot and dry, low humidity, the moisture evaporates quickly. So your clothes don't even often stay very wet. And so it's harder to tell you're losing water even though you obviously are. So a leaf, it's thinner, it's out there in the sun, the stomata are there, and plants can lose a lot of moisture through a leaf. The leaf can even shrivel up and die, and then that would kill the plant. So a lot of desert plants, especially in truly hot, dry deserts, have lost their leaves because leaves would be a liability. And so we're talking about plants like cacti and other relatives that are the dominant plants in the hottest, driest deserts. And so they've basically also evolved different ways that they basically create their own energy outside of the Calvin cycle. And these variations that we're going to look at basically increase the efficiency and help conserve water and energy in those desert plants that are fighting in a pretty harsh climate to survive. And then ultimately, again, these plants are important because every other living thing in these deserts are still going to depend on those for their source of food. So C3 plants use carbon dioxide directly from the air to drive photosynthesis. This is the type of photosynthesis we've just been looking at. So more specifically, these are called C3 plants because they basically produce a 3-carbon molecule and then again use ATP and NADPH to ultimately make a 3-carbon simple sugar, and enough passes, ultimately it makes that C6H12O6. So in most plants that aren't in deserts, the stomata open to let the CO2 in. But again, that also lets oxygen out, and it also lets water out. So anytime those stomata are open to get CO2 inside to be able to photosynthesize, because again, without CO2, we can't do the Calvin cycle to make a simple sugar. But again, just like in your home, every time you open the door, for whatever reason, some of that cool air gets out, and then your AC has to work a little bit harder to cool your house back down. And so in a plant, every time the stomata open to let CO2 in or oxygen out, they're also losing moisture. Not moisture they want to get rid of, but moisture that's just going to evaporate out because the door is open. We talked about the enzyme that's important in this process. It catalyzes the joining of this RUBP and CO2 as we go through the Calvin cycle. But Rubisco isn't really efficient at grabbing those CO2 molecules. So the problem is that when the concentration of CO2 inside the leaf starts dropping because it's being used to make glucose, so when the CO2 concentration starts getting low, the Rubisco starts actually grabbing oxygen instead of CO2. And then that leads to what could be a problem for the plant called photorespiration, which means we're actually using sugar instead of making it. Now again, you wouldn't think generally that the atmosphere, the air is all around us. And because there's CO2 in the air, you generally wouldn't think there would be a lack of it. Two things here. First of all, air actually can get depleted of CO2. You've got a leaf of a plant, right? And you've got the stomata on the underside of the leaf. When those stomata open up and they're taking in oxygen and CO2 right around the leaf, they can actually use up all the CO2 molecules that are right in that little air space, right where the air, the air we're breathing is touching the leaf. And so unless there's air movement like a breeze blowing to push fresh air in and replenish those CO2 molecules, there is potential for a plant to run out of CO2. But the problem we're talking about here in a hot, dry area is if you have a leaf of a plant, and again, the underside, if the plant, because it's hot and dry and it's the middle of the summer in Reading, if that plant opens up its pores to try and get CO2 in, it's losing more water vapor, losing more moisture, and not getting in enough CO2, then the plant is going to be in a state of photorespiration. Basically, it could lead to the same sort of thing that we would see in an animal, something like heat stroke. Basically, it's not plants don't get heat stroke, so it's not an exact comparison. But the point I'm getting at is, if the plant's opening up its pores, its stomata to take in CO2, and it's losing more moisture because it's so hot and dry that the water is just being sucked out of the plant, then it's just going to keep its stomata closed. And even though plants can store some amount of CO2, eventually, because it's photosynthesizing, the CO2 is going to be used up inside of the plant. And if it stays hot and dry and the stomata stay closed, then again, the plant is going to start basically using sugar instead of creating sugar as a survival mechanism. So the plant is just fighting to stay alive at that point. So because of that, because of the harsh conditions, plants have evolved um, alternate methods or alternate processes for dealing with living in such hot, dry climates. Type of plant that has evolved to live in these types of deserty climates are one type anywhere called C4 plants. So some of the grasses that we might have in our lawn around Redding or any of the hot climates anywhere from Redding down to Bakersfield, Bermuda grass, for example, but even corn, sorghum, some of those kinds of plants are C4 plants. They're actually derived from plants that were originally in very hot, dry climates. And so they've evolved a different way to be able to incorporate that CO2. There's an enzyme that can actually pick up on the carbon even when the stomata are closed, because again, in hot temperatures, middle of the day, the stomata are going to be closed so the plants don't lose too much moisture. And even when the CO2 concentration starts dropping, the C4 plants use a different enzyme, so it's more efficient at grabbing the carbon instead of the oxygen, so the plants can still continue to photosynthesize and make glucose molecules. And again, I mentioned Bermuda grass. It's good and it's evil all at the same time. It's great that it can live in the kind of climates we have in a lot of the Central Valley of California, but it's also really aggressive and can take over other grasses. Crabgrass also fits in that category. It's very efficient, very good at living in hot, dry climates, but that can be at the expense of other native plants. Like star thistle, it's a plant that is adapted to living and thriving in the hot, dry summers. It starts growing about the time that most other plants start dying back in the late spring, early summer, and so then it thrives because everything else has gone dormant. It has other adaptations. Star thistle does, it can send roots down 6-8 feet in the ground, which is much, much deeper than most other small, plants. So it has an advantage there as well. And then the other, so there's a diagram on the left of what's going on inside of a C4 plant. Again, we still have CO2 coming in, the C4 cycle that ultimately feeds the Calvin cycle, and then ultimately we produce sugars. Your book has just a brief, a brief explanation of how C4 differs from the normal process of photosynthesis. So not a huge focus, but it is still interesting, or at least basically you should know that there's more than one way that plants complete the process of photosynthesis to deal with different climates. CO2 is initially incorporated into a 4-carbon molecule instead of a 3-carbon molecule like in normal C3 photosynthesis. And whether we're talking about C4 or full CAM plants, CAM stands for crass-solution acid metabolism. So full-on desert plants like cacti basically still start off with a 4-carbon instead of a 3-carbon molecule, and then basically have a lot of similarities. Still goes through the Calvin cycle ultimately, but a big part of it is that the stomata remain shut during the day, so you don't have that transpiration, the losing moisture, and then they open at night to collect CO2. And so again, you're avoiding the hottest part of the day by opening at night to collect your CO2. But again, where it's different is that CO2 then is actually stored, more of it is stored. Normal photosynthetic plants open up their stomata during the early mornings, later afternoons, or in the middle of the day, just not in the middle of the summer. And they take in CO2, it's incorporated into a 3-carbon molecule, and photosynthesis occurs until the stomata shut and the CO2 run out. Again, what's different here is the stomata open at night, take in as much CO2 as they can, and it's stored as a 4-carbon molecule, an acid called a malate, and then that malate acid is stored in the vacuoles of the cells of the plants. And then during daytime, because again, remember, part of the cycle still requires the sun, then that malate is transported into the chloroplasts, where then it's converted back to CO2 first, because it needs to be in the form of CO2, and then it's used in the process of photosynthesis. So again, normal C3 plants take in CO2, go through the light reactions that generate ATP and NADPH. That NADPH and ATP fuel the Calvin cycle to ultimately generate the glucose or the sugar. But in C4 plants, that carbon is incorporated into a 4-carbon molecule instead of a 3-carbon molecule. And then in the full CAM plants, that first part of the process happens at night instead of during the day. So they're losing less moisture to the dry desert conditions. And then during the day, the rest of the process kicks in. So overall, the process is much the same, but in some cases it's the timing, or 3-carbon versus 4-carbon molecules, or the fact that the carbon may actually be stored as a different type of molecule that's then converted back when it's needed. And then just a couple quick things in addition to the way that desert plants have adapted to different versions of photosynthesis. They also had to adapt in other ways to these hot, dry climates. Most cacti have some type of spine or prickles or pokey things, and those are just strictly methods of keeping animals from eating you. Remember, you're succulent, you've got lots of moisture. Animals still need moisture. So whether you're a bird trying to peck into that plant to get at some moisture, an animal wants to eat you, if you're nothing but spines and pokey things, it's going to be less likely that an animal's going to want to try and eat you. So you're protecting yourself there by adapting all of these nasty things. And there really are almost no cacti and very few desert plants in general that don't have some type of ornament on the outside of them as a mechanism to keep from getting eaten. And then, of course, you get just some Dr. Seuss plants, I call them, like Joshua trees that have evolved in the desert in the very southern part of California. You look across the landscape, there's little bunches of grass or sage or other species of plants. Not even really any true cacti in this desert, but you've got these dominant trees that are actually in the yucca family that have evolved and adapted to living in these really hot, dry climates. If you've ever been through New Mexico, Arizona, there are these type of cacti called octio or octio. Those are the ones kind of growing up in clusters. These actually are plants that have leaves, which again are not as prominent in desert plants, but they're very small, thickened leaves. They have thick, waxy coverings on the leaves. which help them from evaporating water. These are actually kind of neat because what I learned when I lived there is people cut these down and then they stick them in the ground like along a fence line, and they grow back, and then you create this sort of natural fence. What you can't see is all those ocotillos do have all kinds of spines on them, so they also make a good fence because they're spiny, and so even animals don't like to go walking through them. So they cut them down, put them along the fence line, and sometimes you don't even need barbed wire because they do a good job of keeping the animals in place. But then you look at what we might think of as a typical North American desert. This would be the Sonoran Desert, southern Arizona, northern Sonora, Mexico. You've got the barrel cactus in the front, the opuntia, the prickly pear cactus, in other words. You've got the saguaro cactus in the background, the ones with the arms, the ones you see in all the Western movies. There's ocotillo, there's some smaller mammillaria cacti. People think of deserts as being not too interesting, not much diversity, but especially deserts like the Sonoran Desert have a lot of diversity. A lot of it are cacti and other plants that are adapted to desert life, but lots of snakes, lots of lizards, quite a few mammals, lots of birds, a lot more diversity than people think. And it's only because you don't stop and really just kind of observe what's going on. And then finally, a couple of last thoughts here about pigments and then some specialized organisms. We talked about chlorophyll and chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. There also are anthocyan pigments in plants. And we see these especially in the fall when the plants start really getting stocked up for the winter. And so you get a lot of, you're producing a lot of sugars to get energy stored for the winters, for plants that lose their leaves. And then these anthocyan pigments appear as the plants, the trees that have the red leaves that change red in the fall. When leaves are green in general, it's because they have chlorophyll, which again is a green pigment. And that presence of chlorophyll actually hides the other pigments that are there. They're never gone, but the chlorophyll masks them. Light regulates chlorophyll production, so in the northern hemisphere in the summer we've got long days, and so that long day time basically causes plants to produce lots of chlorophyll. As we move into the fall and the days start getting shorter and shorter, less chlorophyll is being produced, that green color starts fading away, and then that allows the other pigments to show up, the ones that we like looking at in the fall colors. The reds, the oranges, the yellows, and all the colors in between. We don't tend to have areas in California, up here anyway, where we get all the really pretty ranges of colors in the native vegetation, but we do in our landscapes because of all the different plants we put in our landscape. So we still get some of these pretty fall colors, just not quite like farther east with all the different species of oaks and maples and hickory and walnut and all the other trees that generate these really pretty colors. Our oaks pretty much go from green to brown, and you might be in an area where there's some aspen and we get some yellows with the aspen, but we don't have the production of the other pigments like the carotenoids or so forth. We tend to have the tannins, which again, in our oaks out here pretty much give us the brown color instead of some of the other more pretty colors. And then you start needing that really colder fall weather to really kind of kick in the color display. Back east, there was always, the news would always talk about the fall color, and so they would tell you when it was starting, and then basically, you know, when it would peak. So they'd let you know, like right now, it's the peak of fall color in northern Maine, or you know, wherever it was, so that you could get out there and see it. Then the last thing to look at are we've been talking about photoautotrophs, right? Plants that make their own energy from the sun. There is one other category of autotroph, and that would be the chemoautotroph. Plants that make their own energy, but not from sunlight, from other chemicals. So we actually have bacteria that are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. We have other chemoautotrophs. This is an image of one of the pools you might find in a place like Yellowstone. You get that really brilliant deep blue color because the water is so clear, because it's boiling. And people think that means it has no life in it. That's not exactly true. There aren't any fish or anything swimming around in there because it's way too hot. But all of the colors you see, from the greens to the yellows to the oranges to some of the reds, are all different type of bacteria. And they're actually utilizing the sulfur that's being released from deep under the earth, the sulfur that's being released into these pools. Or it could be other chemicals down at the bottom of the ocean. But they still use the CO2, which is in the water, in the air, but they get their energy from oxidizing hydro or dinitrogen sulfide, ammonium, or iron, or other chemicals, but again, not from using sunlight. They use other chemicals to make their own energy. And then they provide the base for the food pyramid in whatever ecosystem they're in, whether it's these little pools here or the bottom of the ocean where you have chemoautotrophs that are providing the base of the food chain for things that live at the bottom of the ocean. You get these chemoautotrophs that live in pretty hazardous climates or pretty hazardous areas. They can exist in toxins like from the Iron Mountain mine, whereas again, that would be toxic to most living things. There are bacteria that actually thrive, and we actually use that as a way to help combat some of the toxins that can be in our environment. We use the fact that we can apply these bacteria to actually use some of these toxic compounds, and then they produce as byproducts compounds that aren't as toxic. So it's kind of a way to clean up chemicals. Not everything, of course, but certain ones. These organisms are also considered to be thermophiles. They live in extremely hot climates. Again, the water can be at or even above boiling, which would kill anything else that was in it. They can live in very acidic water. pH is down around 2, which again would also be way too acidic for anything else to live in. But again, these organisms have evolved over time to find a niche where they can thrive, where nothing else can exist. So they don't really have competition. They as long as they've got their CO2, as long as they've got whichever chemical they're utilizing, they can thrive, whether it's in these volcanic vents, hot springs, cracks in the bottom of the ocean floor. All right, so that wraps up Chapter 5. Again, like most things, some of the concepts that I went through, you're going to have to go back and study, reread, look at videos, whatever. But as always, if you have any questions, if anything isn't clear or I didn't cover something well enough for you to understand it, by all means, don't ever hesitate to send me an email. And next time we'll be on to chapter 6, I believe.